I never thought the roof over my head would become my prison. That's what happens when you open your door to family and forget to set boundaries. I bought my house with pride, built my business with grit, and raised my son with love. But the moment I let them in, I stopped being Avery the homeowner and became Avery the ATM. They ate my food, used my water, filled every room with their chaos. And then one Tuesday afternoon my father stood in my kitchen, the kitchen I paid for, and screamed that my son and I were freeloaders. I stood there holding Lucas's lunchbox, frozen, while the word echoed off walls that had my name on the deed. That's when I realized something had to break, and it wasn't going to be me. Not this time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I wasn't always the person who said yes to everything. I used to have edges, clear lines between what was mine and what I'd share. But somewhere along the way those lines got smudged, redrawn, and eventually erased. Started small, the way these things always do. My parents needed a place to stay after their landlord sold the building they'd rented for a decade. Just a couple of months, my mom said. Just until we figure things out. I had a spare bedroom. I had space. I had a son who barely knew his grandparents because life had gotten so busy. So I said yes. Tom and Barbara Mitchell moved in on a Saturday in early September. They arrived with 3 carloads of belongings, far more than 2 months' worth, but I didn't say anything. My dad carried boxes with a slight grimace, reminding me about his back, the one that had kept him from working odd jobs since he retired. My mom set up the guest room with her own bedding, her own curtains, her own decorations, transforming it into something that no longer felt like mine. But I smiled. I wanted them to feel comfortable. I wanted Lucas to have grandparents who were present, who showed up for school pickups and bedtime stories. I wanted to prove I could handle it all, the business, the kid, the family under one roof. The first month was fine, almost nice. My mom cooked dinners a few times a week. My dad fixed a squeaky hinge on the front door. They watched Lucas when I had client calls. It felt like help, like family the way it's supposed to be. But then the second month came and went. No mention of leaving. No apartment hunting. When I gently brought it up, my mom sighed and said the market was impossible right now, that rent prices had skyrocketed, that they just needed a little more time. My dad nodded along, scrolling through his phone, not even looking up. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was being generous, not foolish. By month 4, Dylan called. My older brother, the one who always had a deal cooking, always had something big just around the corner, always landed on his feet until he didn't. His voice was tight, strained in a way I wasn't used to hearing. He'd been evicted. Not his fault, he said. Landlord was a jerk, market was brutal, Stephanie was stressed, the kids were confused. They needed a place to land. Just for a little while. Just until the next commission check cleared, until they found something better. He had 2 kids. Tyler was 6. Emma was 4. I thought about Lucas, about cousins playing in the backyard, about family dinners that felt full instead of lonely. I thought about my nephew and niece sleeping in a car or a motel. So I said yes again. Dylan and Stephanie moved into the basement with Tyler and Emma. It wasn't finished in the fancy sense, but it was livable. I'd put in carpet years ago, painted the walls a soft gray, added a space heater for the colder months. It was supposed to be storage, maybe a future game room for Lucas. Instead, it became a temporary home for 4 people who promised it wouldn't be long. Stephanie thanked me with tears in her eyes. Dylan clapped me on the shoulder and said he owed me big time. I felt good. I felt like I was doing the right thing, the kind of thing family does for each other. The kind of thing that people would do for me if I ever needed it. Except the house started feeling smaller. Louder. The grocery bill doubled, then tripled. I found myself buying bulk everything at Costco every week, filling the fridge only to watch it empty within days. My water bill jumped. The electricity spiked. I started getting notices about exceeding average usage in my neighborhood, but nobody offered to chip in. Nobody asked what they could cover. When I hesitantly mentioned that things were getting expensive, my dad waved me off and said I made good money, didn't I? Dylan said he'd get me back once the big sale went through. My mom said family doesn't keep score, so I stopped mentioning it. I absorbed the cost, the noise, the shrinking space, and told myself this was what love looked like. Then Brooke called. My younger sister, the free spirit, the one who'd been bouncing between apartments and couches and boyfriends for years, always chasing the next creative breakthrough. Her lease was up. Her roommate bailed. She didn't have first and last month's rent saved. She had Justin, her boyfriend, a guy I'd met twice, who played bass in a band that performed in bars to crowds of 7 people. They needed a place. Just temporary. Just until she sold enough art, until his band got the gig they were waiting on, until things aligned. I looked around my house, already bursting, already chaotic. I thought about saying no. But Brooke cried. She said I was her only option, that she'd be on the street otherwise, that Justin had nowhere else to go either. She said she'd never ask me for anything again. So I cleared out my home office on the 2nd floor, moved my desk into the corner of my bedroom, and said yes one more time. They moved in with garbage bags full of clothes, instruments, canvases, and an air mattress that made my office unusable for anything except sleeping. Brooke hugged me and said I was saving her life. Justin nodded and said he appreciated it, man, like I was somebody doing him a solid instead of his girlfriend's sister giving up her workspace. Within a week, the house smelled like incense and takeout. The living room became a rotating stage for music practice, art projects, and whatever Justin decided needed his attention that day. I couldn't work from home anymore. The noise was constant. So I started going to the Grind, the coffee shop on Fremont, spending money on lattes just to have a quiet place to meet deadlines. I kept telling myself it was temporary. They all kept saying it was temporary. But months passed and nothing changed except my bank account and my stress levels. I was covering the mortgage, the utilities, the internet, the groceries, the household supplies. I was the only one working consistently. My dad's back kept him from doing anything physical. My mom's part-time hours barely covered her own personal expenses. Dylan's sales were always just about to pick up. Stephanie stayed home with the kids, which I understood, but it also meant another mouth to feed with no income. Brooke sold a painting here and there, $20 on Etsy after fees. Justin played gigs that paid in drink tickets. And me? I worked. I designed logos, built websites, managed clients, hit deadlines, and somehow kept my business growing while my home became a halfway house I funded entirely on my own. Lucas started asking questions. Why was his room the only one he didn't have to share? Why were Tyler and Emma always eating his snacks? Why was Grandpa always on the couch watching TV but never playing with him? Why did Uncle Dylan promise to take him to the zoo but never did? I didn't have good answers. I just kept saying family helps family, that we were lucky to have people around, that this was what love looked like. But I could see the confusion in his eyes. He was 8. He knew something was off. He just didn't have the words for it yet. I started keeping receipts. Not because I planned to do anything with them, but because I needed to see it for myself. I needed proof that I wasn't imagining the weight of it all. Mortgage, $2,400 a month. Utilities, averaging $400. Groceries, $800 minimum. Internet streaming services, phone bill. I let my parents use, household repairs, school supplies for 3 kids instead of 1. I opened a spreadsheet one night after everyone had gone to bed and started adding it up. 3 years. That's how long my parents had been there. 2 years for Dylan's family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 1 year for Brooke and Justin. The numbers made my stomach turn. Over $127,000. That's what I'd spent keeping everyone afloat while they contributed nothing. I didn't tell anyone about the spreadsheet. I just kept updating it every month, watching the numbers grow while my savings shrank. I used to have an emergency fund. I used to have retirement contributions. I used to plan vacations for Lucas, weekend trips to the coast, maybe Disneyland one summer. Now I was living paycheck to paycheck despite running a successful business, because every dollar I earned was feeding, housing, and subsidizing 6 extra people who treated my generosity like an entitlement. The thing nobody tells you about being the dependable one is that people stop seeing you as a person. You become a resource, a solution, a safety net that's always there so they never have to worry about falling. My family stopped asking if they could stay. They just stayed. They stopped offering to help. They just expected it. And I kept giving because I didn't know how to stop without feeling like I was abandoning them, without becoming the villain in a story where I was supposed to be the hero. But heroes get tired. Heroes run out of things to give. And heroes eventually realize that saving everyone else means drowning yourself. I just didn't know I was underwater yet. I was too busy keeping everyone else's heads above the surface to notice I couldn't breathe. The grocery store became my second home. Every Sunday morning I'd load Lucas into the car and we'd make the trek to Costco, armed with a list that seemed to grow longer every week. Industrial-sized boxes of cereal, flats of eggs, enough milk to fill a small dairy, bread that would be gone by Wednesday, snacks that disappeared before I could even put them away. Lucas would sit in the cart, swinging his legs, asking why we needed so much food. I'd tell him we had a full house, that feeding everyone was just what we did. But the truth sat heavier each week as I watched the total climb at checkout. $200. $300. Sometimes more. Nobody ever came with me on these trips. Nobody offered to help load the car or carry the bags inside. I'd pull into the driveway, arms aching from hauling everything up the porch steps, and find my dad on the couch watching a game. Dylan would be in the basement on his laptop, supposedly working leads. Brooke would be painting in what used to be my office, headphones on, oblivious to the world. My mom might glance up from her phone and say something like, "Oh good, you went shopping," as if the groceries materialized by magic. I'd unload everything alone, putting items away while Lucas helped by handing me boxes, the only person in the house who seemed to notice I was doing something that mattered. The bathroom situation became a war zone. We had 2 bathrooms. One upstairs, one down. 7 people trying to share 2 bathrooms meant someone was always waiting, always complaining, always leaving a mess someone else had to clean. Stephanie's makeup covered the upstairs counter. Tyler and Emma left toothpaste smeared across the sink. Dylan's shaving cream cans piled up because he never threw anything away. My mom's medications took up an entire shelf. Brooke's hair products multiplied like rabbits. Expensive bottles she ordered online that she claimed were investments in her brand. I found myself cleaning both bathrooms every other day, scrubbing toilets that 4 different families used, wiping mirrors, restocking toilet paper that vanished at an alarming rate. I bought the toilet paper. I bought the paper towels, the dish soap, the laundry detergent, the trash bags, the light bulbs, the air filters. Every single item that kept the household running came out of my account. When the washing machine started making a grinding noise, I called the repair guy and paid the $200 service fee. When the furnace filter needed replacing, I ordered them in bulk online. When the kitchen faucet started leaking, I watched a YouTube video and fixed it myself at 11 at night because I couldn't afford another repair bill that month. I became the maintenance crew, the supply manager, the financial backbone of an operation that nobody else seemed to think needed their contribution. Dinner time turned into a production I both dreaded and couldn't escape. My mom cooked occasionally, which sounds helpful until you realize she only made things she wanted to eat, never asking what Lucas liked, never considering that an 8-year-old doesn't want spicy curry or liver and onions. Stephanie cooked even less, claiming she was too tired from watching the kids all day, even though Tyler was in 1st grade and Emma was in preschool most mornings. Brooke didn't cook at all, surviving on smoothies and whatever leftovers she could scavenge. Dylan would swing by fast food places and bring home dinner for his family only, eating it in the basement while the smell wafted upstairs. Justin ordered pizza on the rare occasions his band got paid. Never offering to share beyond a single slice, he'd wave at me like it was a grand gesture. So I cooked. After working all day, after picking up Lucas from school, after helping with homework and listening to his stories about recess and reading groups, I'd stand at the stove making enough food to feed 8 people. Pasta, chicken, rice dishes, anything that could stretch and fill stomachs cheaply. I'd set the table, call everyone down, and watch them file in like customers at a restaurant. They'd serve themselves, sometimes going back for seconds before I'd even sat down, before Lucas had gotten his portion. They'd eat, scroll through their phones, talk around me, and then leave their plates on the table for me to clear. Every single night. Dishes piled in the sink, leftovers needed to be stored, counters needed wiping, and I'd stand there doing it all while everyone retreated to their spaces, satisfied and full on food I'd bought and prepared. Lucas stopped inviting friends over. At first I didn't notice the shift, too caught up in managing everything else. But one afternoon he came home from school quiet, withdrawn in a way that felt wrong. I asked him what happened. He shrugged. I pressed gently. Finally, he told me that he'd invited his friend Mason over to play, but Mason's mom said maybe another time. This was the 3rd time it had happened. Different friends, same result. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked Lucas if he knew why. He looked at me with those big brown eyes and said, "Mason told me his mom said our house is too crowded and too messy." I walked through my house that evening, really looked at it for the first time in months. Toys scattered across the living room floor, none of them Lucas's. Coats piled on the chair by the door because the coat closet was stuffed with everyone else's things. Shoes everywhere, sizes and styles I didn't recognize. The coffee table covered in remote controls, magazines, Justin's guitar picks, Brooke's sketchbooks, my dad's crossword puzzles. The kitchen counter cluttered with everyone's stuff, mail and keys and receipts and random objects that had no home because every space was occupied. My beautiful craftsman house, the one I'd saved for and renovated and decorated with such care, had become a cluttered, chaotic crash pad. And my son was being excluded from normal childhood experiences because of it. I tried to reclaim some order. I bought bins and labels, organized the coat closet, cleared the coffee table, deep cleaned the kitchen. It lasted 3 days. By Friday, everything was back to chaos. Nobody maintained anything. Nobody put things away. Nobody seemed to care that we were living in disorder because it wasn't their house, wasn't their problem, wasn't their responsibility. I was the only one who cared, and I was outnumbered 7-1. The noise was its own special kind of torture. Justin practiced bass in the evening, the thump of it vibrating through the walls. Tyler and Emma ran through the house screaming, playing games that involved maximum volume and minimum supervision. My dad watched television at a volume that suggested his hearing was going. Sports commentators shouting through the living room at all hours. Brooke took phone calls on speaker, her voice carrying through the whole second floor as she talked to friends about her art, her relationship, her feelings. Dylan and Stephanie argued in the basement, their voices rising through the floorboards, fighting about money they didn't have and problems they couldn't solve. The only quiet space was Lucas's room, and even that felt like a refuge under siege. I started wearing headphones just to create a bubble of peace. I'd sit at the grind for hours, paying $7 for a latte that bought me the right to occupy space that felt calm. I took meetings there, did design work there, responded to emails there, anything to avoid going home before I absolutely had to. Harper, my best friend since middle school, started asking if I was okay. We'd meet for coffee and she'd study my face with concern, noting the circles under my eyes, the way I'd zone out mid-conversation, the exhaustion that had become my default state. I'd tell her I was fine, just busy, just managing a full house. She didn't push, but I could see the worry in her expression. Lucas's teacher requested a conference. Miss Peterson, a kind woman in her 50s who taught second grade for 20 years, sat across from me in a tiny chair and said Lucas seemed distracted lately. His homework was getting turned in late. He was tired during class. He'd fallen asleep during reading time twice. She asked if everything was okay at home. I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to tell her that home had stopped being a home and started being a burden. That my son couldn't sleep because there was always noise. That he couldn't focus on homework because there was nowhere quiet to work. That I was failing him by trying to help everyone else. Instead, I smiled and said we had family staying with us, that it was temporary, that things would settle down soon. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't quite believe me. Money became a constant source of stress. My business was doing well, truly well. I had steady clients, good contracts, referrals coming in regularly. I should have been comfortable building savings, planning for Lucas's future. Instead, I was living in a constant state of financial anxiety. Every client payment went straight to covering household expenses. The mortgage, the utilities, the food, the supplies, the repairs, the unexpected costs that kept popping up. Dylan borrowed $40 for gas, promised to pay me back, never did. Brooke needed art supplies for a commission, swore she'd reimburse me when the client paid, didn't. My mom mentioned needing new glasses, suggested I had good insurance through my business that might cover it, implying without directly asking. The requests were constant, casual, delivered with the assumption that I'd say yes because I always said yes. I started tracking every expense in obsessive detail. Not just the big things, but everything. The $12 for dish soap. The $30 for laundry detergent that lasted half as long with 7 people using it. The replacement light bulbs, the toilet paper, the trash bags, the aluminum foil, the coffee everyone drank but me because I got mine at the cafe. I documented it all, adding it to my spreadsheet in a ritual that felt both necessary and masochistic. The numbers grew. $23,000 in year 1, $41,000 in year 2, $63,000 in year 3 and counting. I was spending more keeping everyone else afloat than I was spending on myself and Lucas combined. But the money was only part of it. The real cost was harder to quantify. The loss of privacy, of peace, of space to think and breathe and exist without constantly managing someone else's needs. I couldn't walk through my own house without encountering someone's crisis, someone's mess, someone's expectation. I couldn't have a phone call without someone interrupting. I couldn't watch a show without someone changing the channel. I couldn't make plans without someone assuming I'd babysit or drive them somewhere or pick something up while I was out. My life had become a support system for everyone else's existence, and I was disappearing in the process. Lucas asked me one night why we never did things anymore, just the two of us. We used to have Saturday adventures, trips to the children's museum or the zoo, or just walks through the neighborhood stopping for ice cream. We used to have movie nights, curled up on the couch with popcorn watching whatever he wanted. We used to read together before bed, chapter books that we'd take turns with, his small voice stumbling over big words while I helped him sound them out. All of that had evaporated. Saturdays were for grocery shopping and house maintenance. Evenings were for cooking and cleaning. The couch was always occupied. Bedtime had become rushed, a quick hug and kiss before I collapsed into my own bed, too exhausted for stories. I promised him we'd do something special soon. Just us. Maybe a weekend trip to the coast, to Cannon Beach where we used to build sandcastles and hunt for agates. His face lit up with hope that made my chest ache. But even as I said it, I was calculating the cost, wondering if I could afford it, knowing that leaving for a weekend meant coming back to a house that would be even more chaotic, to people who might resent my absence even though they never contributed to my presence. The resentment started as a whisper, easy to ignore. Little moments of irritation that I'd push down, tell myself I was being selfish, remind myself that family helps family. But whispers have a way of growing louder when they're not acknowledged. Every time I cleaned up after adults who should have cleaned up after themselves, the whisper got louder. Every time I paid for something nobody thanked me for, the whisper got louder. Every time I sacrificed something for Lucas because I couldn't afford to give him what he deserved while supporting everyone else, the whisper became a shout I could barely contain. I started fantasizing about what it would feel like to come home to quiet, to walk through my door and find only Lucas's shoes by the entrance, to open my fridge and see groceries that would last more than 3 days, to sit on my couch without having to move someone's stuff, to sleep through the night without bass vibrating through the walls or arguments seeping through the floor, to exist in my own space without constantly managing other people's lives. The fantasy felt both impossible and desperately necessary, a dream I couldn't reach but couldn't stop reaching for. Harper noticed. We met for coffee on a Tuesday morning, her day off from the hospital where she worked as a nurse. She took one look at me and said, "You're not okay." It wasn't a question. I tried to deflect, to give her the same line I'd been giving everyone, but she cut me off. She told me she'd driven by my house the previous weekend, saw all the cars in the driveway, noticed the basement light on at 2 in the morning, and realized I was drowning. She asked me point blank how much I was spending to keep everyone housed. I told her. Her face went pale. She asked me what they contributed. I looked away. She closed her eyes and said, "Avery, this isn't help. This is exploitation." The word hit me like cold water. Exploitation. I'd been calling it generosity, calling it family, calling it temporary. But hearing someone else name it for what it was made something crack open inside me. I started crying right there in the coffee shop. Ugly tears I'd been holding back for months, maybe years. Harper held my hand across the table and let me fall apart. She didn't tell me what to do. She just witnessed my breaking, and somehow that made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I wasn't imagining the weight. I wasn't being dramatic or selfish or ungrateful. I was being used, and I'd been letting it happen because I didn't know how to stop without becoming the villain in my own story. The breaking point didn't announce itself with trumpets or warning signs. It came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when I picked Lucas up from school and found him sitting alone on the bench outside the office, his backpack clutched to his chest like a shield. His eyes were red. My heart dropped before I even reached him. Miss Peterson stood nearby, her expression grave in a way that made my stomach knot. She asked if we could talk inside. Lucas held my hand so tightly I could feel his pulse through his palm. The story came out in pieces. There had been an incident at lunch. Some kids were talking about their houses, about sleepovers and game nights and weekend plans. Lucas had mentioned wanting to have friends over but said his house was too full right now. One kid, a boy named Ethan who Lucas had considered a friend, laughed and said his mom told him that Lucas's family was poor, and that's why so many people lived together. Other kids joined in. The words trailer trash got thrown around, even though we lived in a decent neighborhood in a house I owned outright. Lucas tried to defend us, tried to explain, but 8-year-olds don't have the vocabulary for complex family dynamics. They just hear crowded and assume poverty. The teasing escalated until Lucas shoved Ethan, something he'd never done before, and both boys ended up in the office. Miss Peterson was gentle but firm. She understood Lucas was defending himself, but the physical response wasn't acceptable. I nodded, numb, while she talked about consequences and behavior expectations. But all I could think about was my son being mocked for a situation he didn't create, suffering social consequences for my inability to set boundaries with my own family. Lucas apologized to Ethan under the teacher's supervision. We walked to the car in silence. Once inside, he asked me in a small voice if we were poor. I told him no, we weren't poor. He asked why everyone lived with us then. I didn't have an answer that made sense to a child. I didn't have an answer that made sense to myself anymore. That evening I didn't cook dinner. For the first time in 3 years I ordered pizza for just Lucas and myself. 2 personal pizzas, his favorite toppings and mine, delivered to the grind where we sat in a booth by the window and ate without talking about the day. He asked if we could do this more often, just us. Promised we would. When we got home at 7:30, the house was in chaos. My mom wanted to know where dinner was. Dylan asked if I'd brought food back for everyone. Brooke complained that she'd been waiting to eat, assuming I'd handle it like always. I walked past all of them without responding, took Lucas upstairs to his room, helped him with homework, read him 2 chapters of the book we'd been neglecting, and tucked him in with an extra long hug. When I came back downstairs, my dad was standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed. He wanted to know what my problem was, why I was acting strange, why I couldn't just make something simple for everyone. I stood there looking at him, this man who'd been living in my house for 3 years without paying a single bill, and something inside me went very quiet and very still. I asked him when he planned to move out. He blinked, genuinely confused by the question. He said they were still looking, that the market was impossible, that I knew how hard things were right now. I asked him what he'd been doing to prepare financially. He got defensive, said his back prevented him from working, that I knew that. I asked about my mom's income. He said it barely covered their personal expenses, that they were doing their best. I pulled out my phone and opened my spreadsheet. I turned the screen toward him and watched his face as he saw the numbers. 3 years of mortgage payments he'd never contributed to. 3 years of utilities, groceries, household expenses. $134,000 and counting. His face went red. He said I was being ridiculous, that family doesn't keep score, that I was throwing their struggles in their face. I asked him what he thought I'd been doing for 3 years if not carrying everyone's struggles while my own got heavier. He called me ungrateful. Said they'd raised me, sacrificed for me, that this was the least I could do. I asked him to name one sacrifice they'd made since moving in. He couldn't. He just repeated that family helps family, that I was being selfish, that I'd changed. The argument drew everyone else. Dylan came up from the basement demanding to know what was going on. Stephanie followed, holding Emma, with Tyler peeking around her legs. Brooke and Justin emerged from upstairs, both looking annoyed at the disruption. My mom joined from the living room where she'd been watching her shows. They formed a semicircle around me in my own kitchen, and I realized with horrible clarity that I was surrounded by people who saw me as a resource, not a person. Dylan jumped in to defend our dad, saying I was being dramatic, that everyone was just going through a rough patch, that I should be grateful I had the means to help. I asked him about the rough patch that had lasted 2 years. He said the market was tough, that he was working on it, that a big sale was coming. I asked him how many times he'd told me that. He told me not to be a bitch about it. The word hung in the air like smoke. My mother gasped but didn't defend me. Stephanie looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Brooke shifted her weight, studying her nails. Justin stared at his phone. My father nodded as if Dylan had made a reasonable point. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a bone setting after being broken for too long. I told them all very calmly that I needed them to start contributing financially or start making concrete plans to leave. The response was immediate and unified in its hostility. My dad said I was being unreasonable. Dylan said I was holding money over their heads. Brooke started crying, saying she couldn't believe I'd threatened to kick her out when she was finally getting her art career off the ground. My mom said she was disappointed in me, that she'd raised me to be more compassionate than this. I looked at each of them, these people who shared my blood and my space but not my burdens. I asked them if they knew how much Lucas's school supplies cost this year. Silence. I asked them if they knew I'd been sleeping 4 hours a night, because I was working after everyone went to bed just to keep up with clients while managing the household. Silence. I asked them if any of them had noticed I'd lost 15 pounds because I was so stressed I forgot to eat most days. My mother said I looked fine, that I was being dramatic for attention. That's when I realized there was no getting through to them. They weren't going to suddenly see what they'd been doing. They weren't going to have an epiphany and start contributing. They were going to keep taking until there was nothing left of me to take. I went to my room, locked the door, and called Harper. She answered on the first ring. I told her what happened. She asked me what I wanted to do. I said I didn't know, that I felt trapped, that these were my parents, my siblings, that I couldn't just throw them out. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that cut through all my guilt and confusion. She said, "They're not treating you like family, Avery. They're treating you like a doormat. And Lucas is watching you teach him that this is normal." The truth of it took my breath away. Lucas was watching me accept disrespect, accept exploitation, accept being called names in my own home by people I supported. I was teaching him that love meant erasing yourself, that family meant tolerating abuse, that having means meant you owed it to everyone else. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle around me, feeling the weight of too many lives pressing down on the foundation I'd built. By morning I'd made a decision. Not an impulsive one, not a revenge fantasy, just a clear and necessary boundary that should have been set 3 years ago. I waited until everyone was awake, until they'd all helped themselves to the breakfast food I'd bought, until they were settled into their routines. Then I gathered them in the living room. Dylan complained about interrupting his work. Brooke said she had a video call in an hour. My dad said this better be important. I told them it was. I gave them 60 days notice. 60 days to find new housing, to figure out their situations, to make arrangements. I told them I'd continue covering the mortgage and utilities through that time period, but after that, the free ride was over. The reaction was explosive. My father stood up, his face purple with rage, jabbing his finger at me as he shouted that I was abandoning my family, that I was selfish and cruel, and that they'd given me everything. I asked him to list what they'd given me in the last 3 years. He couldn't. Dylan called me heartless, said I was destroying the family over money, that I clearly cared more about my bank account than my own blood. I told him he was right, I did care about my financial survival, especially since I was the only one funding his family's existence. Stephanie burst into tears, saying they had nowhere to go, that I was putting her children on the street. I reminded her they'd had 2 years to figure something out and had chosen not to. Brooke took a different approach. She got very quiet, very sad, telling me she understood I was stressed but that this wasn't the solution, that I was going to regret pushing everyone away. That money couldn't buy the family bonds I was breaking. I looked at her, at this sister I'd supported for a year, whose rent I'd essentially paid, whose art supplies I'd funded, whose boyfriend I'd housed and fed, and I felt nothing but exhausted pity. I told her the bonds were already broken, that they'd been breaking them every day they took without giving, every day they criticized without contributing, every day they made my house feel like a prison instead of a home. She called me cold. Justin, speaking up for the first time, said I was on some kind of power trip, that I was using the fact that I owned the house to control everyone. I told him he was free to leave immediately if he felt that controlled. My mother tried the guilt approach. She reminded me of every sacrifice they'd made when I was young, every time they'd helped me, every way they'd supported my dreams. She said family was forever, that I couldn't just turn my back on them, that one day I'd need help and no one would be there. I felt the familiar pull of that guilt, the weight of obligation that had kept me compliant for so long. But then I thought about Lucas sitting on that bench, about the teasing he'd endured, about the childhood experiences he was missing because I couldn't say no to people who never said thank you. I told my mother that they'd been helping themselves to my resources for 3 years and calling it love. I told her that real family wouldn't drain me dry, and then act offended when I asked for basic respect. The argument lasted for over an hour. Voices were raised, accusations were thrown, tears were shed. Through it all, I remained calm, repeating the same message. 60 days. Find somewhere else to live. This arrangement is over. Dylan threatened to sue me, though for what I couldn't imagine. Brooke said she'd blast me on social media, that everyone would know what kind of person I really was. My dad said I'd regret this, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. My mom said she'd never forgive me. I absorbed it all, every threat and insult and prediction of doom, and I felt lighter with each word. They were showing me exactly who they were, and I was finally ready to believe them. After they scattered to their respective spaces, slamming doors and making angry phone calls to relatives who would hear their version first, I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop. I opened my email and sent a message to my landlord friend Marcus, asking if he knew of any available rentals in the area, studios or one-bedrooms, reasonably priced. I researched tenant rights, eviction procedures, wanting to make sure I was doing everything legally. I documented the conversation we just had, noting dates and details in case I needed them later. I wasn't being cruel. I was being smart. I was protecting myself and my son from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted to do the right thing without force. Lucas came downstairs around 10. It was Saturday and he'd been in his room with headphones on during the whole confrontation. He asked me what all the yelling was about. I knelt down to his level and told him the truth, aged appropriately but honest. I told him that Grandma and Grandpa, Uncle Dylan and Aunt Stephanie and the cousins, Aunt Brooke and Justin were all going to find their own places soon, that it was time for our house to just be ours again. His eyes went wide. He asked if they were mad. I said yes, they were upset, but that sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to keep their families healthy. He was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he asked if we could go to the coast now, just us like I'd promised. I looked at his hopeful face and made another decision. I opened my laptop and booked a hotel room in Cannon Beach for that very night. One night away, just the two of us, before the next 60 days of hell began. We packed quickly, me throwing clothes into a bag while Lucas gathered his favorite toys and books. I left a note on the kitchen counter saying we'd be back Sunday afternoon. Nothing more. No explanation, no asking permission, no checking if anyone needed anything. We walked out to my car with our bags and I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Even temporary, even small, it was freedom. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw my dad watching from the living room window, his expression unreadable. I didn't wave. I just drove. The drive to the coast took 2 hours. Lucas and I sang along to his favorite songs, stopped at a roadside stand for fresh strawberries, talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. The hotel room was small but clean, with a view of the ocean that made Lucas gasp with delight. We spent the afternoon on the beach, building sandcastles, collecting shells, letting the cold water rush over our feet while we laughed at nothing in particular. We ate fish and chips at a small restaurant on the main street, grease dripping down our fingers, not caring about manners or mess. We walked through the town as the sun set, stopping in little shops, buying Lucas a small toy whale he'd been eyeing. We went back to the hotel and watched a movie in bed, his small body curled against mine, his breathing eventually evening out into sleep. I lay awake long after he drifted off, listening to the ocean through the open window, feeling the salt air on my skin. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about what needed to be done tomorrow, who needed what from me, how I was going to stretch the budget to cover everyone's needs. I was just existing, breathing, being present in a moment that belonged only to me and my son. I thought about the next 60 days, about the conflict that was waiting at home, about the family members who would try to manipulate and guilt and threaten their way back into permanent residence. I thought about standing firm, about holding my boundary even when it felt impossible, about choosing Lucas and myself even when it meant being called selfish. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something that wasn't exhaustion or resentment or guilt. I felt hope. Small and fragile but real. Hope that maybe I could reclaim my house, my peace, my life. Hope that maybe teaching Lucas to set boundaries was more important than teaching him to be endlessly accommodating. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I deserve to be more than a resource for everyone else to drain. The ocean kept rolling in, steady and relentless, and I fell asleep to its rhythm, dreaming of a future where my home felt like a home again. The ride back to Portland on Sunday felt heavier than the drive out. Lucas sensed it too, growing quieter as we got closer to home, his small hand finding mine as I navigated the familiar streets. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Dylan's truck was gone. So was Brooke's beat-up sedan. Only my parents' old Camry sat in its usual spot, angled awkwardly as if parked in anger. I grabbed our bags and walked Lucas inside, bracing for whatever awaited us. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I found my mother in the kitchen, washing dishes with sharp, aggressive movements that made the plates clatter. She didn't turn around when we entered. My father sat at the dining table with papers spread before him, reading glasses perched on his nose. He glanced up, his expression cold. Lucas squeezed my hand tighter. I told him to go upstairs and unpack, that I'd be up in a minute. He hesitated, looking between me and his grandparents, then nodded and climbed the stairs slowly, glancing back twice. My father spoke first. He said Dylan had left that morning, taken his family to stay with Stephanie's mother in Gresham. Said it was crowded there, uncomfortable, that the kids were confused and upset. He delivered this information like an accusation, as if I'd personally driven them out into a storm. I asked if Dylan had left a forwarding address. My father's jaw tightened. He said Dylan would be in touch when he was ready to talk to me again, whenever I came to my senses. I nodded, refusing to engage with the bait. I asked about Brooke. My mother finally turned, her eyes red but dry. She said Brooke and Justin had gone to stay with a friend, someone with a couch they could crash on. She said it like I should feel ashamed, like I'd reduced my sister to sleeping on furniture. I asked if they'd started looking for apartments. The silence that followed told me everything. My father said they'd need more than 60 days, that I was being unreasonable, that no one could find affordable housing that quickly. I reminded him they'd had 3 years to save money, 3 years to prepare for eventual independence. He slammed his hand on the table, making the papers jump. He said they'd been preparing, that they'd been trying, that the economy was against them. I asked to see proof. Bank statements, job applications, apartment listings they'd contacted. Anything showing effort. He told me I had no right to demand proof, that I was treating them like criminals instead of family. My mother joined in, her voice shaking. She said I'd become someone she didn't recognize, that the daughter she raised would never treat her parents this way. She said I was choosing money over love, material things over blood. I felt the familiar guilt rising, the conditioning of 30 years trying to pull me back into compliance. But I thought about Lucas upstairs, probably listening to every word, learning what it meant to stand up for yourself or to cave under pressure. I told my mother that I'd been choosing everyone else over myself for 3 years, that my choice now was simply to stop doing that. She called it selfish. I called it survival. The conversation went in circles for another 20 minutes. They tried every angle. Guilt about their age, about my father's health, about how they'd sacrificed when I was young. Anger about my ingratitude, my coldness, my betrayal. Bargaining about staying just a little longer, contributing a small amount, making it work somehow. None of it moved me. I'd made my decision on the coast, watching my son sleep peacefully for the first time in months. I wasn't going back. When they realized I wouldn't budge, my father gathered his papers and left the room. My mother followed, pausing at the doorway to say that I'd regret this, that family was all we had in the end, that I was making a terrible mistake. I told her I'd already been living with a terrible mistake for 3 years. She flinched like I'd struck her. That evening I made dinner for just Lucas and myself. Grilled cheese and tomato soup, his favorite comfort meal. We ate at the kitchen counter, not the dining table, creating our own small space in the big house. He asked me if Grandma and Grandpa were going to leave too. I said yes, in a couple of months. He asked if they were mad at me. I said yes, but that sometimes doing the right thing makes people angry, especially when they don't want to take responsibility for themselves. He thought about this, dragging his spoon through his soup. Then he asked if it was wrong that he felt relieved. My heart broke and mended simultaneously. I told him it wasn't wrong at all, that I felt relieved too, that wanting peace in your own home was completely normal. The next few weeks were tense but manageable. My parents barely spoke to me, communicating through post-it notes left on the counter or terse text messages. Dylan called once, his voice tight with anger, demanding to know why I was doing this to him, to his kids. I reminded him I'd given 60 days notice, that this wasn't sudden or unexpected. He said 60 days wasn't enough, that I was being rigid and unfeeling. I asked him how much time would be enough. He couldn't answer. He just said I'd changed, that I used to be nice, that money had made me mean. I told him money hadn't changed me. Being drain dry had changed me. He hung up. Brooke reached out through text, her messages alternating between pleading and accusatory. One message would be about how much she appreciated everything I'd done, how she knew I was stressed, how she wanted to make things right. The next would be about how I was destroying her life, ruining her chances at success, punishing her for being an artist in a world that didn't value creativity. I stopped responding after the fifth message. There was no conversation to be had, just manipulation dressed up as communication. Harper checked in daily, sometimes just a text asking how I was holding up, sometimes a phone call where I could vent without judgment. She was my lifeline during those weeks, the reminder that not all relationships were transactional, that real support existed outside my family. At the 30-day mark, my mother came to me with a folder. She'd found an apartment, a one-bedroom in a complex near the mall. It was small but affordable on her part-time income if my father got a job. She showed me the listing, her hands shaking slightly, pride and defeat warring on her face. I told her it looked good, that I was glad she'd found something. She asked if I'd help with the deposit and first month's rent, just to get them started. The ask was so predictable I almost laughed. I told her no. She stared at me like I'd spoken another language. She said she couldn't afford it without help, that she'd shown me the place assuming I'd understand they needed assistance. I told her I'd given 3 years of assistance, that it was time for them to figure it out themselves. She called me cruel, said I was kicking them out and refusing to help them land safely. I reminded her I'd given 60 days notice, that I was continuing to house them rent-free during that time, that anything beyond that was not my responsibility. She said responsibility was exactly what this was about, that children owe their parents care in their old age. I said care didn't mean financial support, didn't mean housing, didn't mean sacrificing my own stability. I said I'd be happy to visit them, to have them over for holidays, to maintain a relationship that had healthy boundaries. She said that wasn't enough. I said it would have to be. She went back to her room and I heard her crying through the door. I felt sad but not guilty. There's a difference I was finally learning to recognize. Dylan called again at the 45-day mark, his tone different. Defeated. He said staying with Stephanie's mother wasn't working out, that they needed to find something permanent but couldn't afford much. He asked if they could come back, promised they'd contribute this time, swore things would be different. I asked how much they'd saved in the past month. He admitted they'd saved nothing, that Stephanie's mom was charging them for food, that his commissions had been slow. I asked how things would be different if nothing had changed. He got angry again, said I was twisting his words, that I was supposed to be on his side. I told him I was on my side now and Lucas's side, and that he needed to figure out his own situation. Brooke showed up unannounced on a Thursday afternoon. I was working at the kitchen table when she let herself in with the key she'd never returned. She looked rough, her hair unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, makeup smudged under her eyes. She said she needed to talk. I closed my laptop and waited. She sat across from me and launched into a speech that sounded rehearsed. She talked about how hard it was being an artist, how the world didn't understand creative people, how she'd been on the verge of a breakthrough when I pulled the rug out. She said Justin's band had a showcase coming up, that this was their big chance, that she couldn't focus on her art while worried about being homeless. She asked for just 3 more months, then 6. Then she'd be stable, then she'd never ask for anything again. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her how much art she'd sold in the past year. She said it wasn't about quantity, it was about building a brand. I asked how many paid gigs Justin's band had booked. She said the music industry was complicated. I asked what concrete steps they'd taken to improve their financial situation. She said they were working on it, that these things took time. I told her their time at my house was up in 15 days. She started crying, real tears this time, not the manipulative kind. She said she didn't know what to do, that she was scared, that she felt like a failure. I felt a pang of sympathy, But I didn't rescind the boundary. I told her fear was a powerful motivator, that she'd figure it out because she had to, that I believed she was capable even if she didn't believe it herself. She asked if I even cared about her anymore. I told her I did, but that caring didn't mean enabling, didn't mean setting myself on fire to keep her warm. She said I sounded like a self-help book. I said maybe I'd been reading self-help books because I'd needed help setting boundaries with family who didn't respect me. She left without another word, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. I sat in the silence afterward, shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but steady in my resolve. Lucas came downstairs and asked if I was okay. I told him I was. He hugged me tight and said he was proud of me. 8 years old, and he understood what the adults in my life refused to see. The final week arrived with a flurry of activity. My parents packed their belongings with grim efficiency, boxes stacking up in their room. My father had found work, finally a part-time position at a hardware store. It wasn't much, but combined with my mother's income, they could afford the one bedroom. They didn't speak to me during the packing process. On moving day, Dylan showed up with his truck to help them. He didn't acknowledge me beyond a curt nod. I stayed upstairs with Lucas, keeping him occupied while they loaded everything. When the truck was full, my mother came to the bottom of the stairs and called my name. I came down halfway, maintaining distance. She said they were leaving, that this was my last chance to make things right. I said I hoped they did well in their new place. She shook her head sadly and walked out. My father followed without a word. Dylan left last, pausing to look at me with something between pity and contempt before closing the door. I waited until I heard the truck pull away before I moved. Then I walked through the house, room by room, seeing it clearly for the first time in 3 years. The guest room they'd occupied was a mess. Damaged walls where they'd hung things, carpet stained from spills never cleaned. The bathroom needed deep cleaning, grime built up in corners and mildew on the shower curtain. But it was empty. It was mine again. I stood in the doorway of that bedroom and felt a weight lift that I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Lucas found me there. He asked if we could paint the room, make it into something new. I told him we could paint the whole house if he wanted. We spent the rest of the day planning colors, looking at paint swatches online, talking about what we wanted our home to feel like. He chose blue for the guest room, a soft sky blue. I chose sage green for the downstairs bathroom. We made a list of projects, small repairs and updates that would erase the remnants of the past 3 years. It felt like reclaiming territory, like planting a flag on land that had been occupied but never conquered. Brooke was the last to leave. She texted on the 60th day saying she'd be by in the afternoon to get her things. I told her I'd be there. She showed up with Justin and another friend, a guy with a van who barely looked at me. They moved quickly, efficiently, like they wanted to be gone as much as I wanted them gone. Brooke didn't try to talk to me beyond logistics, which box went where, whether she could take the lamp I'd lent her. I said yes to the lamp, no to the decorative mirror that was actually mine. She didn't argue. When everything was loaded, she stood by the van looking at the house, at me. She said she hoped I was happy. I said I was working on it. She said maybe one day I'd understand what I'd done. I said I already did. That was the whole point. She got in the van and they drove away. The house felt enormous and silent. I walked through every room, absorbing the emptiness, the space, the possibility. I opened windows, letting fresh air sweep through rooms that had felt suffocating for years. I turned on music, something I'd stopped doing because someone always complained about the volume or the genre. I danced in my kitchen with Lucas, both of us laughing, spinning, celebrating in a way that felt almost sacred. We ordered Thai food for dinner, sat on the floor of the living room with containers spread between us, eating with chopsticks and talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his day at school, about a project he was excited about a new friend he'd made. I realized I'd barely heard these stories lately, too exhausted to really listen, too drained to be fully present. Now I absorbed every word, asking questions, engaging completely. That night, after Lucas went to bed, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine and my laptop. I opened the spreadsheet I'd been keeping, the detailed record of every dollar spent. $134,612. 3 years, 2 months, 14 days. I looked at that number for a long time, feeling the weight of it. Then I closed the file. I didn't delete it, I might need it later for taxes or records, but I closed it. The tracking was over. The giving without reciprocation was over. The chapter was closed. I started a new document, titled it Fresh Start. Listed out financial goals, savings targets now that I wasn't supporting 7 people. I'd rebuild my emergency fund within 6 months. I'd start Lucas's college fund, something I'd been unable to do while covering everyone else's expenses. I'd take that vacation we talked about, maybe a week at Disneyland, something he'd mentioned wanting for years but I'd always said we couldn't afford. Now we could. Now the money I earned would benefit the people who actually lived here, who actually deserved my support. The realization brought tears I didn't expect, relief so profound it felt like grief for the version of myself who'd been sacrificed at the altar of family obligation. Harper came over the next day with champagne and flowers. She walked through the empty house with a huge smile, opening doors to rooms that no longer housed people who didn't appreciate me. She toasted to my courage, to my boundaries, to the beginning of something better. We sat on my porch, the October sun warm on our faces, and talked about plans. She suggested I redecorate, make the space truly mine instead of just recovering from the occupation. I told her I'd already been thinking about it, that Lucas and I were going to paint, maybe get new furniture, create a home that reflected who we actually were instead of what we tolerated. She asked if I'd heard from any of them. I said no, not since they'd left. She asked if I expected to. I said probably eventually, when they needed something or when enough time had passed that they thought I'd soften. I told her I was preparing for that, mentally fortifying the boundaries, planning responses to inevitable guilt trips and manipulation. She asked if I thought they'd ever understand what they'd done. I said no, probably not. People who take rarely see themselves as takers. They see themselves as struggling, as deserving, as owed. They see the person who stops giving as cruel, not the years of taking as exploitation. She nodded, understanding in her expression. She'd seen it before in her own family dynamics. Different details but the same fundamental dysfunction. Lucas came home from school to find us there, immediately brightening at Harper's presence. She'd known him since he was a baby, was practically an aunt. She asked about his day, genuinely interested, listening to his enthusiastic description of a science experiment involving volcanoes and baking soda. She asked if he liked having the house back to just him and his mom. He said yes so emphatically we both laughed. He said it was quieter, that he could think that he could have friends over now if he wanted. Harper looked at me with tears in her eyes, understanding what that meant, how much he'd been holding in, how much the situation had affected him beyond what I'd even realized. That weekend Lucas did have a friend over. Mason, the boy from school, whose mother had previously declined playdates. I'd reached out to her, explained that our household situation had changed, that it was now just Lucas and me. She'd been kind, understanding, and agreed to let Mason come over. The boys played in Lucas's room, their laughter floating through the house, a sound that felt like healing. Mason's mother picked him up with a smile, commented on how nice and peaceful the house felt. She suggested a playdate at their house next time, maybe a sleepover eventually. Lucas beamed. After they left, he hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, thanking me for making things normal again. I told him this was better than normal. This was what home was supposed to feel like. The months that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. I worked from home again, reclaiming my office space, no longer needing to escape to coffee shops for productivity. My business grew because I had energy to pursue new clients, to take on bigger projects, to be creative instead of just surviving. My bank account grew too, savings accumulating in a way that felt almost unreal after years of constant depletion. I took Lucas to the coast again, then to the mountains, then on a long weekend to Seattle. We explored, we adventured, we built memories that were ours alone, untainted by obligation or resentment. I redecorated gradually, room by room. New paint covered the damaged walls. New furniture replaced pieces that carried too many memories of invasion. I hung artwork Lucas and I chose together, photos of just the two of us, creating a visual story of our actual family, rather than the extended chaos we'd hosted. The house began to feel like mine in a way it hadn't even before everyone moved in, because now I'd fought for it, chosen it deliberately, claimed it consciously. Every corner held intention instead of compromise. The first contact came 4 months after they'd left. A text from my mother, brief and seemingly casual, asking how we were doing. I responded politely but briefly. We're well. Hope you are too. She replied asking if we could meet for coffee. I said I was busy but maybe in the future. She didn't push. Dylan sent a Facebook message around the same time, a meme about family being important, no words attached. I didn't respond. Brooke called and left a voicemail saying she missed me, that she wanted to talk, that enough time had passed. I didn't call back. I wasn't being cruel. I just wasn't ready, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for relationships that had proven themselves so fundamentally unbalanced. Harper asked if I thought I'd reconcile with them eventually. I said maybe, but on very different terms. I said if we rebuilt relationships, they'd be based on mutual respect, on reciprocity, on acknowledging what had happened and why it couldn't happen again. I said I wasn't interested in rug sweeping, in pretending the past 3 years hadn't occurred, in returning to dynamics where I gave everything and received nothing. She asked if I thought they were capable of that kind of relationship. I said honestly, no. I said they'd shown me who they were through years of actions, and I'd finally started believing them. She said that was probably the healthiest thing I'd said through this whole ordeal. Lucas's grades improved. His teacher commented on it at conferences, noting that he seemed more focused, more engaged, happier. She asked what had changed at home. I told her we'd had some family move out, that things were calmer now. She nodded knowingly and said sometimes space was the best thing for everyone. She showed me his recent assignments, stories he'd written about adventures with his mom, drawings of our house with just 2 stick figures and a sun. She said he talked about me differently now, with pride instead of worry. I left that conference with tears streaming down my face, grateful tears this time, recognition that choosing myself had meant choosing him too. The holidays approached with a different kind of weight. My mother sent a text asking about Thanksgiving plans, clearly hoping for an invitation. I told her Lucas and I were doing something quiet, just us. She replied that family should be together for holidays. I didn't respond. Dylan's wife Stephanie reached out through social media, saying the kids missed their cousin, asking if we could get together. I politely declined, suggesting maybe spring when things had settled more. The truth was I didn't know if there would ever be a spring where I felt safe letting them back in, even temporarily. The risk of them trying to reestablish the old patterns felt too high. Instead, Lucas and I created our own traditions. We volunteered at a shelter on Thanksgiving morning, serving food to people who actually needed help, who were genuinely struggling through no fault of their own. Lucas asked why we were doing this instead of having Grandma and Grandpa over. I told him that helping people who couldn't help themselves was important, but so was protecting ourselves from people who could help themselves but chose not to. He thought about this while spooning mashed potatoes onto plates, then nodded like it made perfect sense. 8 years old, and he understood boundaries better than adults twice his age. We had Thanksgiving dinner at home. Just us, turkey breast instead of a whole bird, simple sides, pumpkin pie from the bakery. We ate on the couch watching movies, breaking all the formal rules my mother would have insisted on. It was the best Thanksgiving I could remember, unmarred by tension or unspoken resentment, or the exhaustion of serving people who never said thank you. Lucas fell asleep against me halfway through the second movie, content and full and safe. I looked around my living room at the peace we'd created, at the life we were building, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Genuine happiness. Not the performance of it, not the hope for it, but the real lived experience of it. Christmas brought another round of contact attempts. Cards arrived from my parents, from Dylan's family, from Brooke. I opened them, read the generic messages about love and family and forgiveness, and recycled them. No guilt came with the action. I'd done my time in the guilt chamber. I'd served my sentence of endless giving. The debt they seemed to think I owed had been paid in full 3 years over. Now I owed myself and Lucas the gift of peace, of stability, of a home that felt like sanctuary instead of a source of stress. I took the money I would have spent on gifts for adults who'd never appreciated them and bought Lucas everything on his list plus a few surprises. I decorated the house the way we wanted, lights and garland and a tree that Lucas and I chose together. We baked cookies without anyone complaining about the mess or eating the dough before it was baked. We watched holiday movies without someone changing the channel or dominating the TV. We existed in our space without interference, and the joy of it felt almost rebellious, like we were getting away with something just by being happy. On Christmas morning, we opened presents slowly, savoring each one, talking about what made each gift special. Lucas gave me a drawing he'd made at school, a picture of our house with the words "Home Sweet Home," written in careful letters. Underneath he'd written just Mom and me. I hung it on the fridge where I saw it every day, a reminder of what I'd fought for, what I'd won. Later that day, Harper came over with her partner. We cooked together, laughed together, played games with Lucas. It was the family I'd chosen, the people who showed up without expecting me to give more than they offered, who brought joy instead of obligation. This was what holidays were supposed to feel like. As the year ended and a new one began, I reflected on the journey. 12 months since I'd set the boundary. 9 months since everyone had moved out. 9 months of rebuilding, of healing, of learning who I was when I wasn't defined by what everyone else needed from me. I'd lost my family of origin in many ways, lost the illusion of what I'd wanted them to be. But I'd gained something more valuable. Self-respect, financial stability, a relationship with my son that wasn't strained by external chaos, peace in my own home, the ability to say no without drowning in guilt, the understanding that love without reciprocity isn't love at all. It's exploitation wearing a mask. I started the new year with a ritual. I wrote letters to each of them, letters I'd never send, saying everything I'd never said. To my parents about how their failure to launch into independence wasn't my responsibility to solve. To Dylan, about how his jealousy of my success had poisoned any genuine sibling connection. To Brooke, about how I'd enabled her learned helplessness and regretted teaching her that charm and tears were substitutes for effort. I wrote it all out, every resentment, every hurt, every moment of clarity. Then I burned the letters in my fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. The words were gone, but the truth remained, integrated into who I'd become. Lucas asked me once if I missed them. I told him the truth. I missed who I'd wanted them to be. I missed the fantasy of a family that supported each other equally, that celebrated each other genuinely, that showed up with generosity instead of entitlement. But I didn't miss the reality of what they'd been, the weight of their constant need, the thankless role of perpetual provider. He nodded and said he didn't miss the crowded house, the noise, the feeling of being invisible in his own home. We understood each other perfectly in that moment, both of us grieving something that had never really existed, while celebrating what we'd built in its place. The house stood quiet around us as evening fell, lights glowing warm through windows that now protected sanctuary instead of housing chaos. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new moments to practice the boundaries I'd learned to set. But tonight I sat on my couch with my son curled beside me, in a home that was finally fully ours. No one taking up space who didn't belong. No one draining resources without contributing. No one calling me selfish for choosing to survive instead of sacrifice. Just us, just peace, just the life I'd fought to reclaim. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Spring arrived with unexpected warmth, cherry blossoms blooming early along our street, petals drifting across the porch like pink snow. Lucas and I had developed routines that felt sacred in their simplicity. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, selecting vegetables together, him carrying the canvas bags with pride. Sunday afternoons at Powell's Books, wandering the aisles, each of us choosing something new to read. Weeknight dinners at the kitchen table where we actually talked, where I heard about his day in detail, where he asked questions about my work and I answered honestly, treating him like the intelligent person he was becoming. The transformation of the house was nearly complete. Fresh paint had covered every wall that bore marks from the occupation years. I'd replaced the worn carpet in the guest room with hardwood, refinished it myself over a long weekend while Lucas stayed with Harper. The bathroom fixtures gleamed, new and modern, erasing the grime that had accumulated from too many people using too few facilities. I'd invested in quality furniture, pieces I actually loved instead of cheap replacements for things that had been damaged. Each purchase felt like a declaration, a stake in the ground saying this space matters, my comfort matters, beauty matters. My business had grown beyond what I'd imagined possible. Without the constant drain of supporting 6 additional people, I'd been able to invest in better equipment, take courses to upgrade my skills, hire a part-time assistant to handle administrative tasks. My client roster had expanded to include companies I'd only dreamed of working with before. The money I earned now served its intended purpose, supporting me and Lucas, building our future, creating cushion for emergencies. I'd rebuilt my savings to a level that let me sleep soundly, knowing we'd be okay if work dried up for a few months. That security felt like luxury after years of living paycheck to paycheck despite earning good income. Lucas had blossomed in ways that made my chest ache with gratitude. His teacher reported he was thriving academically, participating more in class, forming friendships that extended beyond school hours. He joined the soccer team, something he'd wanted to do for years, but we'd never had time or energy to arrange during the chaos. I stood on sidelines every Saturday morning watching him run across the field, his face bright with effort and joy, and felt like I was witnessing a version of childhood I'd nearly stolen from him by prioritizing everyone else's needs. His art had improved too, detailed drawings he'd create at the kitchen table while I worked nearby, both of us comfortable in companionable silence. The first real test came in March. My mother's number appeared on my phone late on a Tuesday evening. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering, my voice carefully neutral. She sounded older somehow, tired in a way that made me briefly sad before I remembered why we were here. She said my father had fallen, nothing serious but a sprained ankle that made getting around difficult. She said they were managing but it was hard. She said this in a tone that suggested I should offer help, should volunteer to come over, should slip back into the old role like the past year hadn't happened. I asked if they needed me to call someone for them, a home health aide perhaps or Meals on Wheels. The silence on the other end was heavy with disappointment. She said she thought I'd want to help personally, that family took care of family. I reminded her gently but firmly that I'd taken care of family for 3 years, that they'd moved out because they chose not to contribute, that my role now was supportive but not sacrificial. She asked what that meant. I said I'd be happy to research resources for them, make phone calls to agencies, help them navigate systems. But I wouldn't be coming over daily, wouldn't be providing hands-on care, wouldn't be falling back into patterns we'd broken for good reason. She called me cold, said my father was hurt and I was talking about agencies like he was a stranger. I told her he'd become a stranger when he stood in my kitchen and called me a freeloader in my own house. The words came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. She made it sound like I wounded her. She said they were sorry that they'd been stressed and said things they didn't mean. I asked if they were sorry for taking advantage for 3 years or just sorry they'd gotten caught doing it. She hung up. I sat holding the phone, shaking slightly but not from guilt. From the adrenaline of holding a boundary against direct pressure. From the strength it took to not cave when the old conditioning screamed at me to fix things, make peace, be the good daughter. Harper came over an hour later, responding to my text. She found me on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild temperature, staring at nothing. She sat beside me without speaking, just being present until I was ready to talk. When I told her about the call, she asked how I felt. I said proud and sad simultaneously, proud for holding firm but sad that it was necessary. She said that was exactly right, that grief and strength could coexist, that mourning the family I'd wanted while protecting myself from the family I had was the healthiest possible response. We sat together watching stars emerge, her presence a reminder that I wasn't alone just because I'd stepped away from people who'd hurt me. Dylan's contact came next, a month later. Not a call but a Facebook message, long and rambling, arriving at 2 in the morning. He wrote about how hard things had been, how Stephanie's mother's house had been unbearable, how they'd finally found a rental but it was expensive and cramped. He wrote about how the kids asked about me, about Lucas, about when they'd see us again. He wrote about understanding now what I'd been dealing with, how having his own household had shown him how much work and money went into maintaining a home. The message ended with an apology, words I'd waited years to hear, followed immediately by a request. Could I loan them $2,000 for summer camp fees for Tyler and Emma? He promised to pay it back over 6 months, swore this was different, said he'd learned his lesson. I read the message 3 times. The apology seemed genuine, the self-awareness real. But the immediate ask revealed everything. He hadn't messaged to apologize for its own sake, to repair the relationship without expectation. He'd messaged because he needed money and I was the bank he'd always withdrawn from. The old me would have sent the money, desperate for any crumb of acknowledgement, willing to buy love with cash. The new me saw the manipulation clearly, the pattern repeating, the lesson unlearned. I typed a response and deleted it 4 times before landing on the truth. I told him I appreciated the apology but wouldn't be providing money. I said if he wanted to rebuild a relationship, it needed to be based on connection not transaction, that I was open to that someday but not while he was asking for funds. I wished his family well and left it there. He didn't respond. The silence told me everything about his priorities. When apology plus boundary resulted in no further contact, it confirmed he'd never valued me as a person, only as a resource. It hurt less than I expected. Mostly I felt relief that I'd seen it clearly, that I hadn't fallen back into old patterns, that I'd chosen myself again. Lucas asked a few days later if I'd heard from Uncle Dylan. I told him yes, but that Uncle Dylan and I needed more time before we could have a healthy relationship. Lucas asked what made a relationship healthy. I told him it was when both people gave and received equally, when nobody felt used, when spending time together added to your life instead of draining it. He said that made sense and went back to his homework, satisfied with an answer that would have confused me at his age because I'd never seen it modeled. Summer brought travel, real travel, the kind I dreamed about during the years of being trapped by obligation. Lucas and I flew to San Diego, spent a week exploring the zoo, playing on beaches, visiting museums, eating ice cream for dinner when we felt like it. We went to Disneyland for 4 days, stayed in a hotel room that felt luxurious in its simplicity, just space for the two of us. Lucas's joy was uncontainable. Every ride and character meeting and fireworks show drawing out squeals of delight that made every dollar spent feel like the best investment I'd ever made. We took pictures constantly, documenting memories that belonged only to us, untainted by resentment or obligation. On the flight home, Lucas fell asleep against my shoulder, clutching a stuffed Mickey Mouse he'd insisted on buying with his own saved allowance. I watched him sleep and thought about alternate realities. If I hadn't set boundaries, we wouldn't be here. We'd be home with me stressed about money I'd spent supporting people who never appreciated it, with Lucas disappointed again about canceled plans, with both of us smaller and sadder, trapped in patterns that served everyone but us. The boundary I'd set had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it had bought us this freedom and joy and the ability to build a life worth living. Brooke's attempt at reconnection came in August, a letter arriving in actual mail, handwritten on expensive stationery. She wrote about missing me, about therapy she'd started, about realizations she'd had about her patterns. She wrote about taking responsibility for her part in the dysfunction, about understanding she'd taken advantage, about wanting to do better. The letter was thoughtful, introspective, lacking the manipulation that had characterized our past interactions. She didn't ask for anything except the possibility of conversation, of slowly rebuilding trust if I was open to it. She included her new phone number and email but said no pressure, that she understood if I wasn't ready or might never be. I sat with that letter for a week, reading it multiple times, analyzing my feelings. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, eager for any sign that someone in my family was capable of growth. But Harper's voice echoed in my mind during our many conversations over the past year. Changed behavior over time was the only real evidence of change, not words or promises or therapy insights. I decided to wait to see if Brooke reached out again without asking for something, to test whether this awareness was genuine or another strategy. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was shorter, sharing updates about her life, asking questions about mine, still not asking for money or housing or anything except connection. The consistency moved something in me. I wrote back carefully, a brief note acknowledging her letters, thanking her for the apology, explaining that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent changed behavior. I suggested we could start with occasional emails, see how that felt, possibly progress to phone calls eventually. I was clear that Lucas and I had built a peaceful life and I'd protect that peace fiercely, that any relationship we rebuilt would have firm boundaries about money and expectations. Her response came 2 days later, agreeing to everything, thanking me for giving her a chance, asking nothing beyond the opportunity to prove she'd grown. We began a careful correspondence, emails every few weeks, superficial at first but gradually deepening. By fall, we'd progressed to monthly phone calls. Brooke told me about a job she'd gotten, administrative work at a gallery, steady income with benefits. She'd moved into a studio apartment she could afford on her own, had ended things with Justin, whose lack of ambition had become clear once they weren't being subsidized. She talked about her art differently now, as something she did for herself rather than as a career that justified not working regular jobs. She asked about Lucas, remembered details from previous conversations, sent him a birthday card with a thoughtful gift bought from her own money. The changes seemed real, sustained, earned through effort rather than performed for effect. I remained cautiously open, never quite relaxing my guard, but allowing connection in measured doses. We met for coffee in October, nearly 2 years since everyone had moved out. It was awkward at first, both of us careful, but genuine warmth emerged as we talked. She looked healthier, more grounded, less like she was floating through life expecting others to catch her. She asked if she could see the house sometime, said she'd understand if I said no. I told her maybe for Thanksgiving, that Lucas and I were hosting Harper and her partner, but one more wouldn't overwhelm the space. She lit up, said she'd bring something, asked what we needed. I told her pie, giving her something specific to contribute, testing her follow-through. She arrived on Thanksgiving with 2 pies she baked herself, plus a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers. Small gestures but meaningful ones. That Thanksgiving was everything the previous years had been, but fuller, richer. The presence of someone trying, adding depth rather than weight. Brooke complimented the house, noting changes I'd made without dwelling on the past. She engaged with Lucas genuinely, asking about school and soccer and his interests without being performative. She helped clear dishes without being asked, contributed to conversation without dominating, left at a reasonable hour with hugs and thanks. After she'd gone, Harper pulled me aside and said whatever Brooke was doing in therapy was working, that the change felt authentic. I agreed but stayed vigilant, knowing that sustained change took years, not months. My parents remained distant, occasional texts on holidays that I responded to politely but minimally. Dylan stopped contacting me altogether after I declined his loan request, our relationship apparently having no foundation beyond financial transaction. I mourned what I'd lost but celebrated what I'd gained, understanding that both could be true simultaneously. The family I'd been born into had failed me in fundamental ways, but I'd built chosen family with Harper, was cautiously rebuilding with Brooke, and most importantly had created a small mighty family unit with Lucas that functioned with health and joy. Work continued flourishing. I hired a second assistant, turned down projects that didn't excite me, raised my rates substantially. Clients paid what I asked because my work was excellent and my boundaries were clear. I found myself mentoring younger designers, teaching them not just technical skills but how to value their work, how to set boundaries with clients, how to build sustainable careers without burning out. I spoke on panels about running a creative business, sharing strategies that had worked for me, carefully not sharing the personal story of why I'd needed to learn those strategies in the first place. Lucas turned 9 in December. A birthday party at our house with 6 friends, manageable chaos that ended at a reasonable hour, leaving the house only slightly destroyed. He'd requested a sleepover with his best friend Mason afterward, the 2 boys camping out in the living room with sleeping bags and snacks and movies. I listened to their laughter from upstairs, the sound of normal childhood friendship, and felt grateful beyond words that he had this now, that our home supported his life instead of strangling it. Mason's mother picked him up the next morning, thanking me for hosting, mentioning how much Mason loved coming over, how peaceful our house felt. The compliment landed differently than it would have 2 years ago. Not as relief that someone couldn't see the dysfunction, but as pride that we'd created something genuinely good. As the second year post-boundary drew to a close, I took stock of the transformation. My savings account held 6 months of expenses plus Lucas's growing college fund. My business was thriving, my calendar booked months in advance with dream clients. Lucas was confident and happy, his report cards excellent, his social life healthy. Our home was beautiful and peaceful, a sanctuary we'd fought for and earned. I'd rebuilt a tentative relationship with one sibling while accepting the loss of others, had created boundaries with parents that protected my peace, even if they'd never understand why. I'd learned to live with the grief of disappointing people who'd always been disappointed in me, unless I was actively serving their needs. The journey had taught me that setting boundaries doesn't make you cruel, it makes you honest. That family who only values you for what you provide isn't family in any meaningful sense. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and your child is disappoint people who've never adequately appreciated you. That piece isn't selfish, it's essential. That you can't pour from an empty cup, but you also shouldn't be expected to. That healthy relationships involve reciprocity. That giving without receiving isn't noble, it's volunteering for exploitation. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, exhausted and resentful and drowning, believing she had no choice but to keep giving until there was nothing left. I wished I could tell her what was coming, that the breaking point would lead to breakthrough, that the guilt would ease, that she'd survive disappointing people who needed disappointing. But she'd had to walk that path herself, had to find her own strength, had to learn through lived experience that boundaries weren't abandonment, they were self-preservation. She'd gotten there eventually, and that woman had become me, someone I barely recognized but deeply respected. On New Year's Eve, Lucas and I stayed home like we had the previous year. But this time Brooke joined us, plus Harper and her partner. We cooked together, played games, counted down to midnight with sparkling cider and noisemakers. When the clock struck 12, we went outside to watch neighborhood fireworks, bundled in coats, Lucas between me and Harper with Brooke standing close enough to belong but not close enough to presume. The sky lit up with colors, explosions of light celebrating endings and beginnings, and I felt the symbolic weight of it, the closing of one chapter and opening of another. Later, after everyone had left and Lucas was asleep, I walked through my quiet house turning off lights, straightening cushions, absorbing the peace. I paused in every room, remembering what it had been during the occupation years and acknowledging what it was now. The guest room that had housed my parents was now a proper guest room, ready for visitors I actually wanted. The basement Dylan's family had occupied was a playroom for Lucas, space for him to spread out and be loud and make messes that were his alone. My office was mine again, organized and functional, supporting the work that supported us. Every space had been reclaimed, redesigned, reimagined. I stood at my bedroom window looking out at the street, at houses lit from within, families doing whatever families do on New Year's Eve. Some of those families were probably healthy, balanced, reciprocal. Others were probably dysfunctional, trapped in patterns they couldn't name or didn't know how to break. I sent a silent wish into the night for anyone drowning under obligation, anyone being drained by people who called it love, anyone being called selfish for choosing survival. I wished them the courage to set boundaries, the strength to hold them, the wisdom to know they deserved better than endless taking disguised as family. My phone lit up with a text from Harper. "Proud of you for everything you've built." I smiled, typed back a heart and set the phone down. Pride was something I'd had to learn to feel, having spent so many years believing that being good meant being useful to others at my own expense. Now I understood that being good meant being honest, meant protecting what mattered, meant teaching my son through example that he didn't owe anyone access to his resources or his peace just because they shared DNA. The house settled around me as I finally headed to bed, old wood creaking in familiar patterns, heat clicking on against the January cold. Tomorrow would start another year, bring new challenges and opportunities, continue the journey of healing that wasn't linear but was undeniably forward. I'd probably hear from Dylan or my parents again eventually, another crisis or need that they'd hope would pull me back into old patterns. But I was ready for that now, had scripts prepared, boundaries fortified, understanding rooted deep enough that manipulation wouldn't work anymore. I thought about Lucas sleeping down the hall, about the childhood I'd preserved for him by choosing differently than I'd been taught. He'd grow up knowing that love didn't mean sacrifice, that family relationships required reciprocity, that peace was worth protecting, even when protecting it disappointed people. He'd grow up with a model of healthy boundaries, of self-respect, of the courage it took to choose yourself when the world told you that was selfish. That might be the greatest gift I'd given him, greater than any vacation or toy or experience. The gift of knowing his worth wasn't determined by how much he gave others, that his value was inherent, that he deserved relationships that filled rather than drained him. As sleep finally came, I felt what had eluded me for so many years. Contentment. Not the temporary satisfaction of a good day or a completed project, but the deep, steady contentment of living aligned with your values, of occupying space you'd fought for, of building a life that served you instead of serving everyone else. The journey from doormat to homeowner of my own life had been brutal, lonely, filled with guilt and grief and growth. But I'd walked it, survived it, emerged stronger and clearer and more myself than I'd ever been. The house that had nearly become my prison had transformed into my sanctuary, and I'd transformed right along with it. That was worth everything I'd lost along the way, worth every disappointed family member, worth every moment of doubt and fear. I'd chosen myself and Lucas, and we were thriving because of it. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. The third year brought unexpected challenges that tested everything I'd built. In February, my business faced its first real crisis when my largest client abruptly went bankrupt, taking 3 months of unpaid invoices with them. The old me would have panicked, would have seen it as punishment for prioritizing myself, would have spiraled into anxiety about money. The new me had contingencies. My emergency fund absorbed the loss without destabilizing us. I had other clients to fall back on, relationships I'd cultivated because I'd had the energy to network properly. I spent 2 weeks anxious but functional, then landed 2 new contracts that more than replaced the lost income. The crisis proved what I'd suspected but hadn't tested. I'd built something sustainable, something that could weather storms because it wasn't already weakened by supporting dead weight. Lucas struggled that spring with a teacher who didn't understand his learning style, who marked him down for asking too many questions, who seemed to prefer compliant silence over curious engagement. Parent-teacher conferences became tense negotiations where I advocated fiercely for my son's needs, something I'd have been too exhausted to do during the occupation years. I requested a classroom change, pushed back on unfair grading, documented everything with the kind of organizational energy I could only access because I wasn't already depleted. The school eventually moved Lucas to a different class where he flourished immediately, his spark returning within weeks. Watching him regain confidence reminded me why protecting our peace had been essential. I couldn't fight for him when I was too busy managing adults who should have been managing themselves. Harper's mother was diagnosed with cancer in March, aggressive and requiring intensive treatment. Harper, my rock through everything, suddenly needed support herself. I showed up without hesitation, bringing meals, driving her to appointments when her partner couldn't, sitting with her in hospital waiting rooms. The difference between this and the family situation was stark and illuminating. Harper thanked me constantly, insisted on reciprocity even when I told her not to worry about it, found small ways to give back despite her overwhelm. When I brought dinner, she saved me leftovers from meals other friends brought her. When I drove her somewhere, she filled my gas tank. When I sat with her during chemo sessions, she asked about my life, my work, Lucas, actually listening to the answers despite her own crisis. One evening, sitting in her mother's hospital room while Harper dozed in the chair beside the bed, I reflected on the contrast. This was what healthy relationships looked like. Both people showing up, both people caring about the other's well-being, both people contributing what they could when they could. Harper's mother, even sick and scared, asked how I was doing, remembered Lucas's birthday, apologized for taking up so much of Harper's time that could have been spent with friends. The apology was unnecessary but revealing. She saw me as a person with my own life, not a resource to be consumed. My family had never achieved that basic recognition. They'd seen me as an extension of their needs, existing to serve, my personhood secondary to my utility. The contrast crystallized something I'd intellectually understood, but hadn't emotionally integrated. I wasn't the problem. I'd spent years wondering what was wrong with me that my family treated me this way. Whether I'd done something to deserve it, whether setting boundaries made me defective. But watching healthy relationships function showed me the truth. Some people were takers. Some people were incapable of reciprocity. Some people would drain you dry and call it love, not because you'd failed them but because that's who they fundamentally were. Accepting this brought grief but also liberation. I could stop trying to fix what had never been fixable, could stop auditioning for appreciation that would never come, could fully release the fantasy of who I'd wanted them to be. Brooke continued her slow redemption arc. She'd been in therapy for over a year now, doing real work on her patterns. Our relationship had graduated to monthly in-person coffee dates where we talked honestly about the past without her getting defensive. She acknowledged specific incidents, not with performative apologies, but with genuine recognition of impact. She shared what she was learning about herself, about how she'd used helplessness as currency, about the ways she'd avoided adult responsibility by playing the struggling artist card. She talked about her relationship with Justin in hindsight, recognizing how they'd enabled each other's worst tendencies, how living rent-free had eliminated any urgency to grow up. What moved me most was watching her build a real life. She'd been promoted at the gallery, was considering pursuing a certificate in arts administration. She'd developed genuine friendships with coworkers, relationships where she gave as much as she received. She'd started dating someone new, a teacher who had his life together, who challenged her patterns instead of reinforcing them. She talked about apartment hunting, wanting to upgrade to a one-bedroom she could afford on her own income, prioritizing financial stability over creative space. The transformation was profound because it was comprehensive. She wasn't just changing how she related to me, she was changing how she moved through the world. I allowed her back into my life incrementally, always watching for backsliding, always ready to reimpose boundaries if needed. She attended Lucas's soccer games occasionally, cheering appropriately but not trying to claim an auntie role she hadn't earned back yet. She invited us to a small art show featuring her work, pieces she'd created in her limited free time, sold for reasonable prices that reflected their worth without the grandiose claims that used to accompany her art. She remembered my birthday without prompting, sent a thoughtful gift she'd clearly put effort into selecting. The relationship wasn't what it had been before, would never be that naive trust again, but it was becoming something real, something based on who we both actually were rather than the roles we played in a dysfunctional system. My parents remained distant ghosts, their presence felt mainly through absence. No calls on Mother's Day or Father's Day, the silence speaking volumes about who had been expected to maintain the relationship. Extended family occasionally reached out, aunts and uncles who'd heard some version of events, usually phrased as concern that I'd cut off my parents over nothing. I had a script prepared for these conversations now, polite but firm. I explained that I'd supported my parents for 3 years, that they'd contributed nothing while criticizing everything, that I'd set a boundary and they'd chosen distance over accountability. Most backed off quickly when faced with specifics. The few who pushed, who insisted family was family, who tried to shame me into reconciliation, got removed from my social media and mental energy. I had no obligation to explain or justify my choices to people who hadn't lived my experience. Dylan surfaced briefly in May, not contacting me directly but appearing in tagged photos on Stephanie's Facebook. They'd had another baby, a surprise third child based on the timeline. I felt nothing looking at the announcement photos, no joy or anger or resentment, just detachment. Whatever relationship we'd had was over, ended by his inability to see me as anything beyond an ATM. I didn't reach out to congratulate them. I didn't block them either. I just let them exist in their lives while I existed fully in mine. Harper asked if it bothered me that he'd never apologized, never acknowledged what he'd done. I said it used to, but I'd realized I was waiting for something he was incapable of giving. Dylan lacked the self-awareness to see his behavior clearly, lacked the emotional maturity to own his impact. Waiting for his apology would be like waiting for a cat to bark. Technically possible but fundamentally contrary to its nature. Summer brought another milestone. Lucas and I had saved enough for a major home renovation, converting the basement into a proper suite with a bedroom, bathroom, and sitting area. Not for family, for rental income. I interviewed potential tenants carefully, chose a graduate student named Priya who was quiet, responsible, and understood the boundaries. She paid rent on time every month, kept to herself, occasionally joined us for dinner when invited but never presumed. The rental income covered my mortgage payment, fundamentally changing my financial picture. I was building wealth now, not just surviving. The house that had once felt like a burden housing people who drained me had become an asset generating income from someone who respected boundaries. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had lived in my house for years contributing nothing, resenting my requests for basic respect. Priya, a stranger, paid me monthly and thanked me for the space. She noticed when I'd mowed the lawn or fixed something, commented on improvements I made, respected shared spaces. She was what a tenant should be, what my family never had been even when they'd functionally occupied that role. Lucas liked her too, appreciated that she was around but not intrusive, that she'd helped him with a science project once without making it a big deal. This was how healthy cohabitation worked, with clear agreements, mutual respect, and appropriate boundaries. Fall arrived with Lucas starting 4th grade, a year that came with increased academic expectations and social complexity. He'd developed a solid friend group, kids who came over regularly, whose parents I'd gotten to know through school events and carpools. I'd become friends with a few of the moms, casual friendships built around our kids but extending beyond them. We'd grab coffee while the kids played, commiserate about homework battles, share parenting wins and struggles. These relationships felt easy in a way family never had, probably because they were chosen, maintained through mutual interest free from obligation or history. One of these friends, Amanda, confided that her sister had been living with her for 8 months, was showing no signs of leaving, contributed minimally, and Amanda felt trapped. The story sounded achingly familiar. I shared my experience carefully, not as advice but as information. I told her about the 3 years, the financial drain, the emotional cost, the boundary I'd eventually set. I told her about the aftermath, the relief mixed with grief, the family members who disappeared when the resource stream ended. She cried in my living room, saying she'd felt like a terrible person for wanting her sister out, for resenting the help she was supposedly providing. I told her what Harper had told me years ago, that enabling wasn't helping, that some love required saying no, that protecting her peace wasn't selfish, it was essential. She set a boundary with her sister the following week, gave 60 days notice just like I had. Her sister reacted with similar outrage, similar accusations of cruelty and betrayal. Amanda called me several times during those 60 days, needing reinforcement, needing someone who understood the guilt and the necessity simultaneously. I talked her through it, reminded her why she'd made this choice, celebrated when her sister finally moved out. Watching her reclaim her space and peace felt like full circle moment. I'd been helped through my crisis by Harper. Now I could help someone else through theirs. The pain I'd experienced had given me something to offer, a hard-won wisdom about boundaries and self-preservation. Thanksgiving that year was bigger, Lucas and I hosting Harper and her partner, Brooke and her boyfriend Priya who had nowhere else to go, and Amanda with her family. 10 people total, but it felt manageable because everyone contributed. They brought dishes, helped cook, cleaned up without being asked, expressed genuine gratitude. Lucas loved it. Loved having a full table without the tension that had characterized past gatherings. After dinner, the kids played in the backyard while adults sat around the table drinking wine and talking. Someone made a toast thanking me for opening my home. I felt tears rise unexpectedly, not from sadness but from the recognition of how different this felt from years past. These people saw me. They valued what I provided. They gave back. This was what family should feel like, chosen or otherwise. Brooke pulled me aside while we were doing dishes, asked if we could talk. My guard went up automatically, old patterns expecting an ask. But she just wanted to thank me for giving her another chance, for not writing her off permanently. She said watching me live with clear boundaries had taught her more than therapy ever could. That seeing me thrive after cutting off people who'd hurt me had given her permission to do the same with relationships that drained her. She said she'd ended a friendship recently with someone who'd been using her for rides and money. That setting that boundary had been terrifying but necessary. She said she finally understood what I'd been trying to protect all along. We hugged, really hugged, and something that had been tense between us finally relaxed. She'd grown up. It had taken years and distance and work, but she'd actually grown up. Winter came early that year, snow falling before Thanksgiving, the city transforming into something magical and inconvenient simultaneously. Lucas and I built a snowman in the front yard, something we'd never had time for during the occupation years when I was too exhausted for spontaneous joy. Neighbors stopped to chat. Kids came over to add sticks and stones and decorations. Our snowman became a neighborhood project, ridiculous and wonderful. Sporting a scarf Priya contributed and a hat from Amanda's son. I stood on my porch with hot chocolate watching it all, feeling a sense of community I'd been too overwhelmed to notice before. These people had always been here. I'd just been too consumed by internal chaos to be present for external connection. Lucas asked me one evening, unprompted, if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. Coming as we decorated the Christmas tree, music playing, both of us humming along. I asked what made him think to ask. He said I seemed different than I used to, lighter somehow, that I smiled more and didn't look tired all the time. He said he remembered when I used to sigh a lot, when my face looked worried even when I was trying to be fun. He said he liked this version of me better and wondered if I liked it too. I set down the ornament I was holding and pulled him close, told him yes, I was happy, happier than I'd been in years, that choosing us had been the best decision I'd ever made. He hugged me tight and said he was happy too, that he liked our house now, that it felt good. His words stayed with me for days. I'd spent so much time worried about how setting boundaries would affect him, whether removing extended family would damage him, whether choosing peace over obligation made me selfish even as a parent. But he'd noticed. He'd felt the difference. He was happier in a home with just us than he'd been in a house full of people who didn't value what we provided. Children noticed more than we gave them credit for, absorbed dynamics they didn't have words for, carried stress that wasn't theirs but affected them anyway. Freeing him from that environment had been as important as freeing myself. Maybe more important. The year closed with quiet celebration, just Lucas and me on New Year's Eve, a tradition now. We cooked together, played games, counted down with sparkling cider and noisemakers. When midnight struck, we went outside to watch fireworks, bundled against the cold. Lucas asked what I was hoping for in the new year. I told him more of what we already had, more peace and time together and joy. He said he hoped I'd write a book someday about what we'd been through, that maybe it would help other people who felt stuck like we'd been. The suggestion surprised me but landed with strange resonance. Maybe there was something there. A way to transform pain into purpose, to offer a roadmap for others still trapped in dynamics that were killing them slowly. Back inside, warming up with hot chocolate, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not a book, not yet, but a blog post. I wrote about the years of giving without receiving, about the guilt that had kept me trapped, about the breaking point and the boundary and the aftermath. I wrote about the family I'd lost and the life I'd gained, about the relief and grief that coexisted, about teaching my son that love didn't mean accepting mistreatment. I wrote for hours, words pouring out, 3 years of experience distilled into coherent narrative. Lucas fell asleep on the couch beside me, and I kept writing, feeling something shift as the story took shape outside my head. I posted it at 2 in the morning, not expecting much, just needing it out in the world. By morning it had been shared 50 times. By evening, 500. Within a week, thousands of people had read it, commented, shared their own stories of family exploitation and boundary setting. Messages flooded in from people who felt seen, who thought they were alone, who needed permission to choose themselves. Some were angry at me, called me heartless, said real family never gave up. But most were grateful, desperate for validation that protecting your peace wasn't selfish, that you didn't owe unlimited resources to people who never said thank you. The response was overwhelming and humbling. I started a support group online for people dealing with similar situations, a space to share stories and strategies without judgment. It grew quickly, hundreds of members comparing notes on setting boundaries with family, supporting each other through guilt and grief, celebrating small victories. I found myself moderating discussions, offering perspective from the other side, assuring people that life after boundary setting was possible, and often better than the before. The community that formed felt purposeful, like my experience could serve something beyond just me and Lucas, could create ripples of healing I'd never anticipated. Harper observed all this with knowing amusement. She said I'd turned my pain into activism, that I'd built something meaningful from something terrible. I said I'd just written honestly and people had responded. She said that was exactly the point, that honesty about family dysfunction was rare and needed, that most people suffered in silence thinking they were uniquely terrible for resenting family members who exploited them. She said I'd given people language for their experience and permission for their boundaries. She said that mattered more than I probably realized. I started getting requests for interviews, for podcast appearances, for articles about setting boundaries with family. I did some, declined others, always protecting Lucas's privacy and my own, sharing the lessons without sensationalizing the pain. My business evolved to incorporate this work. I started offering workshops about boundaries, not just for family situations but for clients, for workplace dynamics, for any relationship where giving exceeded receiving in unhealthy ways. My design work continued, but this advocacy work filled something different. Used skills I developed through necessity, offered healing I hadn't known I needed. The income from workshops and speaking went into Lucas's college fund, tangible proof that our suffering had been transformed into something valuable. Not that the suffering had been worth it, but that it hadn't been wasted, that meaning had been extracted from the mess. Lucas watched all this with pride that made my heart squeeze. His friends knew him as the kid whose mom talked about boundaries, who wrote about family stuff, who helped people. He never seemed embarrassed by it, seemed instead to understand the importance. When his class did a project about people they admired, he wrote about me, not for the boundary setting itself but for having the courage to choose differently than what everyone expected, for protecting us when it would have been easier to keep suffering, for teaching him that love meant respect, not sacrifice. His teacher shared it with me at conferences, said Lucas spoke about our home life with such security and contentment, that it was clear he felt safe and valued. The third year ended with assessment and gratitude. I tallied up the financial difference setting boundaries had made. In 3 years of supporting my family, I'd spent over $134,000. In the 3 years since, I'd saved over $90,000, paid off debt, built an emergency fund, started investments, generated rental income. The contrast was staggering. But the financial difference, while significant, was secondary to the intangible gains. Energy to build my business. Time with Lucas. Peace in my own home. Sleep without anxiety. Joy without guilt. Relationships based on reciprocity. Self-respect. The ability to say no without drowning in shame. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 years ago when my parents had first moved in, naive and eager to help, believing that love meant unlimited giving. I wished I could tell her what was coming, but also knew she had to walk the path herself, had to learn through lived experience that boundaries weren't cruelty, that some relationships couldn't be fixed from the inside. She'd gotten there eventually, become me, someone stronger and clearer and more herself. The journey had been brutal but necessary, had stripped away everything that wasn't essential until only truth remained. On the last day of the year, I sat at my kitchen table with my annual planning spreadsheet open, mapping out goals for the year ahead. Financial targets, business objectives, personal milestones, but also softer goals, things that couldn't be quantified. More presence with Lucas, deeper friendships with chosen family, continued work with the boundary-setting community, possible reconciliation with my mother if she showed sustained change, though I wasn't holding my breath. Forgiveness for myself for all the years I'd spent accepting unacceptable treatment, for the time it had taken me to find my strength, for being human and fallible and doing the best I could with the understanding I had at the time. Lucas interrupted my planning to ask if we could get a dog. I'd been putting it off for years, first because the house was too chaotic, then because we were still settling, then because I wasn't sure we were ready. But looking at his hopeful face, thinking about our peaceful home and stable life, I realized we were ready. More than ready. I said yes, watching him light up with joy. He immediately started researching breeds, making lists, planning. I watched him dive into the project with the security of a kid who knew his home was stable, whose basic needs were met, who didn't carry the weight of adult problems he couldn't solve. This was what childhood should look like. This was what I'd fought for and won. The house settled around us as evening turned to night, warm and quiet in hours. Through the window I could see neighbors' lights glowing, other families doing whatever they did on New Year's Eve. Somewhere out there, people were probably struggling with the same dynamics I'd escaped, drowning under obligation, believing they had no choice, thinking that love meant endless giving. I hoped they'd find their way to boundaries eventually, hoped they'd discover what I'd learned the hard way. That you can't help anyone from an empty cup, that protecting your peace isn't selfish, that family who truly loves you wants you to thrive, not just survive, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say no. The clock crept toward midnight as Lucas and I prepared our traditional celebration, sparkling cider and noisemakers and silly hats. When the moment came, we counted down together, shouted Happy New Year into the quiet house, hugged each other tight. Outside, fireworks exploded across the sky. Neighbors cheered from porches. The city marked the turning of time with noise and light. I held my son close, breathing in the moment, feeling grateful for every hard choice that had led us here, for every boundary that had been met with anger but held anyway, for every guilt trip that had been recognized and rejected, for every day of this life we'd built from the rubble of what had been destroyed. This was my life now, not perfect but mine, not easy but honest, not without pain but without the specific agony of being consumed by people who called it care. I'd lost family members who'd never really seen me as family, gained chosen family who showed up with reciprocity, discovered that home was something you created, not something you were born into. Lucas would grow up knowing his worth wasn't determined by how much he gave others, that boundaries were healthy, not harsh, that peace was worth protecting even when others called it selfish, that legacy felt more valuable than any inheritance, more important than any family tradition, more essential than any shared last name. I'd broken the cycle, chosen differently, changed the story. And we were both better for it. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.